Next, I want to look at a critique of Marx. See whether Marx's micro and macro stories are still standing after a careful critical scrutiny of the main concepts and arguments he uses to defend them. I want to start with a general critique, focusing on his concept of needs and focusing on the historical prediction that Marx's theory is making about capitalism. So let's start with this concept of needs. One of the reasons Marx and his followers was very focused on needs was that they were convinced that in order to keep itself going, capitalism creates pseudo-needs all the time. This leads to the problem of insufficient demand. You've got to get people to want more things. Because of the problem of weak demand, there is a built-in emphasis to constantly create demand for things that nobody needs. But Marx thinks the impulse to create all of these phony needs will go away once you don't need capitalism to innovate. So once you don't have capitalism, you don't need people to constantly think that they have to have the latest type of smartphone. You don't need to try and get people to think of the 30-something kinds of biscuits. This one's better than the other one, that sort of logic. All these manufactured artificial needs are a byproduct of the problem that we have to keep capitalism going. Once that goes away, we can think about people having finite needs. And so if a society reaches a certain level of abundance, for which capitalism is required, then those needs can be met after the socialist revolution, eventually in a communist organized society. So Marx's argument using the concept of needs is that capitalism creates phony needs because of the problem of weak demand, but capitalism, because of its dynamic productivity, also creates superabundance. Once capitalism implodes, for all the reasons he thinks it will implode, it will no longer create artificial needs, so we'll be able to see that human needs are finite, and in a society in which superabundance is taken for granted, these finite needs can be met. What is wrong with this argument? Now, even if we're only trying to meet people's needs defined in a very narrow sense as keeping people alive, there's still going to be endemic scarcity. The notion of superabundance doesn't really make sense if you think about it. So money that we spend, for instance, on dialysis machines is money that we don't spend on heart transplants or on cancer research. So no matter how much wealth there is, there's still going to be distributive choices to be made. There's still going to be distributive conflict. Somebody who needs something else than a dialysis machine to keep them alive is not going to get it. We're not going to do research on cancer because we're spending money doing research on the causes of AIDS, let's say. Once you see this point, that the notion of superabundance becomes incoherent. There's no such thing as superabundance. Without superabundance, though, you cannot get a world that goes beyond entitlement. You're not going to ever transcend the world of scarcity. So if meeting needs, even defined in this very narrow sense of what's necessary to keep people alive, involves trade-offs, what you're really saying is that scarcity is endemic to the human condition. This is an important flaw in Marx's theory, because once you see that scarcity is endemic to the human condition, you can't get away from distributive conflict. You've got to find some way, whether a system of rights, a market, the government making decision, somebody or some mechanism is going to make these distributive decisions. So you reach the conclusion that scarcity is endemic to the human condition, and then Marx's argument about finite needs and the possibility of meeting them no longer stands. In a way, it's ironic that Marx so blind to this, because Marx was the person who also said that human nature is not static, that it evolves through history, we develop and change. But he couldn't see that we would never reach a condition in which scarcity can be transcended. This is behind his utopianism. This idea of superabundance is the same as the idea that scarcity can be, in a future stage of history, overcome. So in a way, the beginning of the end of Marxism is the recognition that scarcity is endemic to the human condition. Before unpacking more of the difficulties with his more specific arguments concerning the collapse of capitalism, I want to focus on a last general critique, very common, made against Marx. This second failure is well known, as I just said, but it's worth mentioning. And it's basically that his historical predictions turned out to be hopelessly wide of the mark. Not only was he wrong in the 1830s and 1848 when he thought that communist revolution were about to sweep through Europe. They were both not communist and quickly reversed in a couple of years. But his larger historical predictions were also wrong. He thought communism would come, socialist revolutions, for all the reasons that he provided in his arguments. He thought that the socialist revolution would occur in advanced capitalist systems that had become uncompetitive because of replacement of competitive capitalism with monopoly capitalism. But in fact, what we saw, revolutions, occurred in peasant society, Russia and China, or in Eastern Europe, in countries where it was actually more or less imposed from the outside by the Soviet Union after the World War II. We didn't really see any society go through the sort of path Marx was thinking of in his larger teleological theory of history, namely from feudalism to capitalism to socialism and to communism. It simply didn't happen. And Marx's bigger idea that there is some purpose or direction in history seems also questionable by the first decades of the 21st century. History doesn't go in a single direction, and this is a theme to which we'll return. You can see movements towards more egalitarian systems and then movements away from those egalitarian systems. You can see democracy created and then you can see it collapse into an authoritarian state. So there isn't a single teleological or directional focus of history of the sort that Marx was looking for. So Marx's dialectical materialism is problematic, and also what's problematic is his argument about the collapse of capitalism based on needs, because his notion of superabundance that informs his communist utopia is incoherent in principle. Distributive conflict is endemic to the human society, no matter how much wealth there is in that society. Some principles for the distribution of income and wealth are going to be necessary regardless of what is produced in society or how it can be produced in that society. Next, we're going to look at Marx's macro theory and talk about some difficulties with this. And then we'll turn back to the micro theory, back into the labor theory of value and its assumptions about workmanship, and try to clarify what is the legacy of Marx's both micro and macro theories. Part of Marx's argument against capitalism, or why capitalism would eventually implode and lead to a socialist revolution, focused on the potential for liquidity crisis, namely that there would be the possibility that people would hoard money and that money would stop flowing through the system and the system would thereby become sclerotic. It is the case that capitalist systems have the potential for liquidity crisis, but one of the things Marx greatly underestimated was the capacity of capitalist states and capitalist societies to address things like liquidity. He underestimated what the state could actually do to preserve capitalism. One example was the huge liquidity crisis in Mexico, where the whole Mexican economy was on the verge of complete collapse. But the Western government, led by the United States, put together in the 1990s a $50 billion package to pump liquidity into the Mexican economy until the crisis was over. And they succeeded. So they didn't see the kind of collapse that the liquidity crisis had the potential to create according to the Marxian analysis. So the argument about the potential for liquidity crisis is valid, but we have no particular reason to think that such liquidity crisis cannot be managed once their source is understood, and governments do have levers available to stave off or to even solve such crises. The second argument that Marx had for why capitalism will eventually implode, had to do with the declining tendency in the rate of profit. Remember, every classical political economist believed that it was definitely the case that there is this phenomenon, and you have to explain in your theory why it occurs. One straightforward problem is that when you look over the long course of capitalism since the 19th century, it's far from clear that there is, as an empirical matter, a long-term declining tendency in the rate of profit. In Marx's case, the declining tendency of the rate of profit had to do with the increasing capital intensity of production. So as capitalists compete by relying more and more on what Marx calls constant capital, he thinks there's less fresh value created, because only human labor power creates fresh value, and the investment that a capitalist makes is in constant capital. So capitalist entrepreneurs, what they do at the margin to be more profitable in the medium run, makes them to be less profitable in the long run. Marx identified this as being the basic dynamic driving the declining tendency in the rate of profit. But there's a big problem with this. In order for this argument to work, it has to rely on the assumption that there is a finite number of industries. So you could grant Marx's argument and say, okay, this argument holds, for instance, in an industry like cotton industry, because as the rate of profit will decrease in such an industry as this industry becomes more and more capital intensive. But that leaves open the possibility that there are all kinds of new industries that are going to come into being all the time. So capital will flow eventually into other industries, and they'll start out with big profit margins, then the profit margins will get competed away, but then capital will go somewhere else. So unless you are committed to this idea, as Marx seemed to be, that there is a sort of fixed numbers of lines of production, such that once profit starts to fall in one of them, they're going to fall economy-wide, there's no particular reason, even working from Marx's other premises, to think that he is going to come up with any lasting account of why the rate of profit will fail in capitalist systems. So even though Marx thought that there was a declining tendency in the rate of profit, it's debatable whether in fact there is one, and it's certainly not the case that his theory explained why it should occur. Now, Marx's third argument is that competition eliminates competitors. Because production is becoming more and more capital intensive, entry costs into an industry are going to go up. You're not going to see new people coming into the market. But again, this is true only under a fairly restrictive set of assumptions, which might not turn out to be true. There are some industry in which there are so-called economies of smallness. Think about the Apple computers that were invented in someone's garage in California and that completely upended IBM and the big established capital-intensive computer firms and totally transformed the market. So it's not necessarily true. What Marx had in mind when he thought about this argument was 19th century industrial production, like steelworks, cotton factories. But this is a very historical bounded perception of what's going on capitalist markets. There might be all sorts of sectors in the economy that tend to resist the development of monopolies, and in which there are various economies of smallness that actually are favorable to the constant entry of new players that keep revitalizing the system, like the information technology sector of the industry seems to be one in which economies of smallness are encouraged. Also, again, Marx underestimated what governments can do to solve this problem of monopoly economies. Marx's fourth argument is about underconsumption, or overproduction, which is the same thing. To put it in Marx's own terms, the argument is that the workers collectively couldn't buy everything they produced. Now, all classical political economists believe that, and early theories of imperialism were partly conceived in order to explain that you get imperialism partly as a result of the search for new markets to address the weak demand in capitalist systems. Again, the problem here is that Marx underestimates the capacity of the state to do things that will postpone crises or manage crises or prevent them from becoming catastrophically bad. You have only to think about what many states have done after the last financial crisis. They have borrowed money, tried to spend it in the part of the economy that will stimulate demand so as to get the economy going back up. The fifth Marxian argument concerns working class consciousness. So Marx thought that while you have all these other things going on that make the system creak at the joints and become less and less functional, the workers would start to become a class for itself. That is, the workers would start to see that they were getting ripped off and get angry about it, become mobilized and militant, and reach the point where they believed that they had nothing to lose but their chains. There are at least two problems with that. Marx thinks that people judge their utility by what others get. They don't just ask the question, am I better off than I was 5 years ago? They also ask the question whether they are better off than someone else. But it seems that people tend to compare themselves only to similarly situated people rather than to anyone else in the system. So workers in the auto industry might compare themselves to steel workers or to coal workers, but not to the CEOs who run the firms in which they actually work. If that's true throughout the occupational state, and if people compare themselves to others but to similarly situated others, rather than to people very far from them in the socioeconomic order, the kind of militancy that Marx was thinking about would not eventuate. You might challenge this problem and respond to it and think that it depends on the type of industry and it depends on the historical times. But more importantly, the argument runs into another problem. The argument depends on the fact that the working class will reach a level of absolute immiseration. Marx seems to conflate relative immiseration of the proletariat with the absolute immiseration of the proletariat. So recall the discussion about exploitation. As Marx defines it, you can raise the wages and at the same time increase the exploitation. If that is true, then you're never going to reach a level of absolute immiseration. You're never going to actually reach the point where workers are literally falling into poverty. And if it is absolute immiseration that has to trigger militant action, the working class consciousness, this is not going to happen. Again, the problem seems to be that Marx underestimates what governments can do in order to avoid or manage such crises. In the 1950s, the English Marxian political economist Ralph Miliband, father of David and Ed Miliband, wrote in a book called The State in Capitalist Society in the 1950s that the welfare state is the capitalist's best friend. Now, we know that the right always attacks the welfare state, but it's capitalism's best friend because it buys off working class discontent and it ensures that workers have a stake in the existing order and that they will never reach this proverbial situation in which they have nothing else to lose but their chains. So when you think about the macro theory and its different components, one discovers that riddled with holes and doesn't add up to the kind of collapse of capitalism that Marx predicted. And therefore, it's not particularly surprising that capitalism doesn't lead to the socialist revolution that Marx envisaged.